Is the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments to be observed on the seventh day of every week, or is it to be observed on specific dates of the month?
Hello, dear listener. Welcome to this presentation coming to you from the home studio of Derrick Gillespie. I hope you will learn something significant from this video. At the end, please don't forget to share so that others can benefit. Thank you, and God bless you.
Hello everyone, my name is Derrick Gillespie, and I welcome you to this special episode of the series Adventist Issues and Answers. In this episode, it is my intention to address a very controversial issue that is causing several members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to lose their way, to actually find themselves splitting the church, not necessarily down the middle, but taking away disciples unto themselves. I would like to spend a few moments addressing this issue, carefully analyzing it in the light of Bible truth and the knowledge that we have from the pages of history. The issue that I'd like to address is the matter of the Lunar Sabbath, what I call the Lunar Sabbath delusion. An illusion, a delusion that is leading many astray. It is my hope that at the end of this presentation, listeners from the Seventh-day Adventist Church will recognize the danger that they are facing and that there can be no other recourse but to avoid this false doctrine. And I say so on the basis that if you have it wrong, then what you end up having when you are observing the Lunar Sabbath is you end up breaking the Sabbath every Saturday on the seventh day of the week. You become an obvious Sabbath breaker when you follow the Lunar Sabbath that is said to be observed or should be observed on specific dates of the month in the Jewish calendar. Some say it should be observed on the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th of each Jewish month, while others say it should be observed on the 7th, on the 14th, on the 21st, and the 28th of each month. What you end up having is clear confusion among those who are advocates of the Lunar Sabbath, said to be observed monthly on specific dates of the month. In this presentation, I will show clearly why the Lunar Sabbath is fraught with problems. In fact, it has more problems accompanying it than solutions that can be presented by the advocates of the Lunar Sabbath theory. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to go straight into the history of the Lunar Sabbath. And one of the first things I ask myself is, where did this teaching come from? For thousands of years, Jews and Christians who are Sabbatarians have been keeping the seventh-day Sabbath each week on a Saturday. So where did this teaching come from about the Sabbath to be observed on specific dates of each calendar month of the Jewish calendar? And so I went to what is called the Lunar Sabbath Encyclopedia. That is where everything related to the Lunar Sabbath is fully explained and details given as to what this teaching is all about. And you can go there yourself. You can see the address at the top of the screen, the lunarsabbath.org, and you will find that linked to the Wikipedia website, and you can go through the details. Now, the first thing I found very fascinating is that in the actual Lunar Sabbath encyclopedia, it makes the obvious admission: lunar Sabbaths are controversial because they are never mentioned directly in Scripture. That's the first problem that I see with the Lunar Sabbath theory. You will not find one scripture in the entire Bible telling you to observe the Sabbath on the 8th, the weekly Sabbath on the 8th, or the 15th, or the 22nd, or the 29th, or the 7th day of each month, or the 14th day of each month, or the 21st day of each month, or the 28th day of each month. Not one scripture can be found. So what the lunar Sabbatarians do is that they gather together a wide variety of scriptures and put them together to try to create a doctrine that nowhere says one direct, thus saith the Lord, the Sabbath is to be observed such and such a date of each month. Now, it is interesting that for Seventh-day Adventists, here is a very serious counsel from the pen of Ellen G. White. She says in Counsels to Writers and Editors, page 15, truth is straight, plain, clear, and it stands out boldly in its own defense. But it is not so with error. It is so winding and twisting that it needs a multitude of words to explain it in its crooked form. That's the first red flag for the lunar Sabbath theory. You will not find one scripture anywhere saying that the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments, is to be observed on specific dates, fixed dates of each month. Nowhere. So where did it come from? If all these hundreds of years, thousands of years, Jews, followed by Christians who were Sabbath keepers, have been keeping the Sabbath on a Saturday, the seventh day of the week. Where did this new teaching come from? And what I found very fascinating is that the same Lunar Sabbath encyclopedia gave me the clear answer. Here it is. The recorded history of Lunar Sabbath begins with a man by the name of Jonathan David Brown, a record producer and audio engineer from Springfield, Missouri. Obviously, this is in the United States. After being released from what he called in his book, which I will speak about shortly, federal sabbatical. This actually was his code word for saying that he was in prison. So while he was in prison, sent to prison by the federal government of the United States, which I'll explain shortly why. He, after being released from what he called his federal sabbatical, he published a book in 1998 called Keeping Yahweh's Appointments. In this book, he laid the foundation for lunar Sabbath theology, arguing that observing lunar Sabbaths supports man's needs to return to nature or natural law. Brown, that is Jonathan David Brown, wrote that he received this understanding by, quote-unquote, prophetic revelation. Those are his own words. Here is the book that was written in 1998, published in 1998 by Jonathan David Brown while he was in prison. He put together his thoughts, which he declared to be prophetic revelation. And that is where the promotion of the lunar Sabbath theory started to take off. Very fascinating. Here we see a picture of the young Jonathan Brown, music recording expert. Here we see him in the studio producing music in the United States. And here we see him on the left of the screen in his older years. And here we see Mr. Brown in his later years, just before he died in 2016. The history says that he died about the age of 60 years old in the year 2016. So first of all, this is not a theologian or some person with serious training in Bible studies. This was a man who was a music recorder, and he was sent to prison. And while he was in prison, after being sent to prison, he said he got prophetic revelation about restoring what he said to be lunar Sabbaths. Instead of weekly Sabbaths on the 7th day of the week, it should be monthly Sabbaths, or Sabbaths set on fixed dates of the month. And how did he get this revelation? According to him, prophetic revelation. Well, the question is, why was he in prison in the first place while he put together his book, which we saw earlier? This book, Keeping Yahweh's Appointments. Why was he in prison? And while he was in prison, he said he got this prophetic revelation. Now, what is interesting is that the story now takes a very serious turn. The federal government, when Jonathan David Brown was arrested, found in his possession various articles which made it clear that Jonathan Brown was a member of a racist white supremacy group in the United States. There you see him seated on the left of the screen. And he's among members of a racist group, white supremacy group, that similar to groups that support Hitler, ethnic cleansing of Jews and blacks and other races that were inferior to the whites. And there is among the white supremacist group, surprise, surprise, who were Ku Klux Klan members. Now, anybody who knows about the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan is a famous anti-Negro, anti-Jew, anti-Hispanics, or the people of Latin American heritage. These were what we call white supremacists who believe that God's true race are the pure whites, and blacks and Jews and Hispanics are not God's people, and therefore they should be cleansed. These are the secret society groups, secret society groups that were known for burning of crosses, lynching or the hanging of black people, bombing and shooting up of Jewish synagogues. That's the group that Jonathan Brown was a member of when he was arrested and sent to prison in 1992. After tried in federal court in the United States, what was he tried for? He was tried for covering up the crimes of associates who he colluded with to hide from the law the truth that they were attackers of a Jewish synagogue. So he helped to cover up the crime of two of the members of the Ku Klux Klan who did a drive-by shooting or shooting up of a Jewish synagogue in the United States. And so Jonathan David Brown was arrested found guilty on charges of colluding with Ku Klux Klan members to hide a crime, a hate crime, and he also lied to the federal government. And so he was sent to prison in 1992. Do the research for yourself. Go online, type in Jonathan David Brown, and write in his Ku Klux Klan connection. These days it is so easy to use ChatGPT or Bing Research or Google to find all the details you need. And you will confirm what I'm saying here about Jonathan David Brown being a member of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacy, Jews hating, Negro hating, Hispanics hating groups. And he was sent to prison for colluding with Ku Klux Klan members to cover up a crime where they shot up a Jewish synagogue in the United States. So it was while he was in prison that Mr. Brown said he got prophetic revelation about the Sabbath not to be observed the way the Jews kept it for thousands of years on a Saturday, but instead monthly, to be observed on specific dates of the month. Now, here is a question I'd like to ask before we move on. Someone in prison for hate crime, for being a member of a secret society, white supremacist hate group, the Ku Klux Klan, sent to prison for lying to the federal government and trying to cover up a crime of an attack upon a Jewish synagogue. How would this person qualify to be given special prophetic revelations from God about restoring the so-called Lunar Sabbath that God allegedly established from the beginning? That's a question I'd like to ask anybody who tries to present the Lunar Sabbath as some special revelation from God. Just like the Gnostics, some hidden knowledge that only special people would get that revelation, and is now being passed on as present truth to be restored in these last days. Why would God pass by everybody else to give this special revelation to a white supremacist, an anti-Negro, anti-Jew, anti-Hispanic, a liar who was sent to prison for covering up a crime, an attack on a Jewish church? While he was in prison, he got special revelation about the Lunar Sabbath. And as I did further research, I realized that the Lunar Sabbath can be traced right back to the Ku Klux Klan members who passed it on to Jonathan David Brown as a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Remember now, the Ku Klux Klan white supremacists, they name the name of Christ, but they are opposed to all groups which they believe are not of the true race. And so while they claim to be Christians and while they claim to be Bible believers, they are hate groups and pushers of racial segregation. Why would God give special revelation of this present truth to Jonathan David Brown, a member of the white supremacist group, while serving time in prison for covering up a crime where the Ku Klux Klan attacked a Jewish synagogue and shut up the synagogue? And when the federal government investigated the crime, Jonathan Brown was among those covering up and hiding and lying to the government about what really happened. That's the first. The second problem with the Lunar Sabbath: its origins, its source is questionable, and it is straight from the pit of hell. Why do I say so? Let's now go to the Bible to prove it. The Bible is the answer. to this issue.
Let's take a look at the Bible. It is, after all, the most important authority in all of this. Let's take
the book of Leviticus chapter 23, where all of the Sabbaths or rest days of the Bible are grouped together. We notice the way God describes each of them and tells specifically when they should be observed. So when we look at verse 1, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts," meaning the festivals, the religious appointments, the holy days, "concerning the feasts or festivals of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations," meaning times to gather the people for worship and for religious ceremonies. "Even these are my feasts." And the first one that was listed among the festivals, the feasts, the holy convocation appointments was the Sabbath. And notice how the Sabbath is described specifically. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest. And holy convocation, ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Now I would like you to notice that the scripture is very plain. It doesn't leave you in any doubt as to what God meant. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day. Now everybody knows. Once you have the basic knowledge of the Jewish calendar and knowledge about the Bible, is that the Jews had in their calendar the days of the week that were numbered. They were not named, they were numbered from the first to the second to the third, and then the 7th one was called the Sabbath. So every day was called, for instance, what we call today Sunday was the first unto the Sabbath. The second day, second unto the Sabbath. The third day, third unto the Sabbath. Where did this come from? Straight from the book of Genesis, where from the very first week of creation, God established a weekly cycle. And every Jew knows that when you speak of the 7th day or the first day of the week, once you use that expression, the first day just by itself, or the 7th day just by itself, it is a clear reference to the numbered days of the week. There is nothing else in Jewish culture that explains the reality outside of this truth. Nothing else. So when God said to the Jews, 6 days shall the work be done, but the 7th day. 7th of what? Only one explanation can be given. The 7th day of the numbered days of the week. Nothing else. This is how the Jews have known it from time immemorial. Notice now when God is describing the Passover and all the other festivals, all the other what are called Sabbaths, God is also specific. He says in the 14th day of the first month. That distinguishes it from just simply saying the 7th day. Why? Because the Jewish calendar had the weekdays numbered 1 to 7. So once you say the first day, we know that in our calendar in the West, that's the first day which we can call Sunday. When you reach the 7th day, you call, it is in our calendar what we call Saturday. And the cycle repeats itself and continues thereafter. 1, 2, 3, 4. So once you say the 6th day shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath, everybody knows it is the 7th day of the week. Can't be nothing else. That's the Bible language. The Jews have known this to be so for their entire history. That is why if you go today to any Jewish synagogue, you will see them continuing to do what they have been doing for thousands of years, keeping the 7th day Sabbath on what we call in the West Saturday. And it corresponds perfectly with their Jewish calendar. Coming to that issue later on in this presentation. But notice now when God comes to the Sabbath which are observed annually, dates in the month, he specifies by saying the 14th day of the first month, the 15th day of the month, and so forth and so forth. And every annual Sabbath, God describes it in specific terms by saying it is so and so of the month. So the question is, if God wanted the Jews, and in fact us today, to keep the Sabbath as specific days of the month, why didn't he say it? God is not the author of confusion. So if he categorizes his Sabbath, the first of the Sabbath is the one that is weekly in the Ten Commandments. It uses a language of Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Here it is. Let's go there. Yes, so here we are. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This is the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. The language of the commandment is specific, and every Jew from then until now knows it is talking about the 7th day of the weekly cycle. If God wanted the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments, the 4th commandment, to be kept as specific dates of a month, he would have said it just like he said the same. He used those specific words about the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Tabernacles. In every single case, God told them specifically what day of what month should the annual Sabbaths or the other rest days should be observed. Why would God leave it up to someone in prison, incarcerated for hate crime and covering up a hate crime, member of a white supremacy group, anti-black, anti-Jew, anti-Hispanics, member of a Ku Klux Klan that burn crosses? Why would God leave that so-called present truth of a lunar Sabbath to be revealed to someone in prison there because of covering up a crime? The Bible is plain. It is as plain as the nose on your face. Everywhere the weekly Sabbath is described by God in commandment, in a commandment, he specifies the 7th day is to be observed as the Sabbath after 6 days of work. Nowhere in the entire Bible is there any specific description or instruction that the Sabbath is related to some set date of the Jewish month. Nowhere. And therefore, if there is where there is no law, there is no sin. If there is no specific instruction by God to keep a lunar Sabbath, it therefore means that to reject the lunar Sabbath is not a sin, because it is not explained anywhere in Scripture. I mean, the Lunar Sabbath Encyclopedia itself acknowledges that lunar Sabbaths are not mentioned directly in Scripture. And here we are seeing the Bible proving it for you. And remember, the Sabbath is linked to the first creation week. Everywhere you go in the history books, it tells you that the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments has its origins in the creation week story. And when we go to the creation week story, here is what we see. When we go to Genesis chapter 1 and we scroll through, we see that as God created, he mentioned that at the end of creating light, evening and the morning were the first day. First day of what? Everybody knows. First day of the week. That's where the week comes from. The word literal week means sevens. A group of 7 days giving you a cycle. And so at the end of 6 days of creating, end of chapter 1, we see where God created man. And at the end of creating man, he said he saw that everything, verse 31, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. 6th day of what? 6th day of the week. Because creation was carried out throughout the week. That's why the commandment of the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, links back the reason for the observance of the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and rested the 7th day. 6 days in the week of creating, 7th day of resting and celebrating. And that cycle continues. When we go to chapter 2 of Genesis, it makes it even plainer. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the 7th day of what? 7th day of that very first week, God ended his work which he had made. By ending here, it suggests that the first week ended as well, and a cycle now continues. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day. 7th day of what? Of the week. That first week. And sanctified it. Notice God did not just set up a Sabbath. He set up a Sabbath specifically linked to a specific day. God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Absolutely plain. The same language used in Leviticus chapter 23 verses 1 to 3 about the Sabbath of the week is the same language used in that first creation week about the Sabbath being blessed and set up and instituted. It's the same language used in the commandment given in Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 to 11. Nowhere in anything related to the Sabbath of the 10 Commandments do you see any mention made about the month. Because every time it mentions the numbered day, every Jew knows that is the numbered day of the week. Very, very plain. Now, because of the clear thus saith the Lord, it is upon this basis why I tell you that any Seventh-day Adventists who get caught up in this Jonathan David Brown theory of a lunar Sabbath, concocted in the mind of an incarcerated prisoner, gathered from the misguided teachings of the members of the Ku Klux Klan, put together in a book called Keeping Yahweh's Appointments. Any Adventists who get caught up rejecting the example of the prophetess Ellen G. White, who kept the Sabbath on a Saturday, all who kept the Sabbath on a Saturday all of their life, rejecting the example of the Jews for the last 2,000 years, and before that, keeping the Sabbath on a Saturday all of their life. You want to reject all of that in favor of Jonathan David Brown and his theories, so-called prophetic revelations. The choice is yours. But what you end up doing is that you're rejecting the clear thus saith the Lord in favor of the fanciful theories of someone who's searching for some hidden knowledge that the rest of us don't have. Gnosticism is what it boils down to. And before I close this presentation, let me give you, apart from those 3 problems identified so far with the Lunar Sabbath. First, the very Lunar Sabbath Encyclopedia admits that there's no scripture in the Bible anywhere describing the Lunar Sabbath, or mentioning directly or giving any command specifically to observe the 7th-day Sabbath on specific dates of the month. Nowhere. That's the first problem. The second problem is its source coming from Jonathan David Brown, clearly an agent of Satan. Third problem is that when we go to the scriptures, as we're seeing right in front of us, as we look at the language of the commandment, and it's linked to the first week of creation, We can't do anything else but accept what it says. Clear, clear, clear. So apart from those three problems, let's look at other problems connected with this theory. Now, the next problem, which is very obvious, is that the lunar Sabbath creates confusion in the minds of their adherents. First of all, you have to go through long, winding road of trying to build a doctrine out of no clear scripture which says, "Thus saith the Lord." So you have to draw inferences there and ideas here and there and bring them together to try to find what may be considered a "Thus saith the Lord." What you end up having is confusion even among the lunar Sabbath advocates. But some people think that, it's only the lunar Sabbath is said to be observed only on the 8th and the 15th and the 22nd and the 29th of each Jewish month. But no, you have other advocates who say, based on their argument and reasoning, it's not based on a clear "Thus saith the Lord," but their argument and trying to so-called calculate what seems to be suggested on the surface. So you end up with another set of lunar Sabbatarians who claim that the true lunar Sabbath is supposed to be on the 7th of each month and the 14th of each month and the 21st of each month and the 28th. So the fourth problem with the lunar Sabbath is that it creates outright confusion. God is not the author of confusion. He says what he means and he means what he says. If he says that the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Pentecost and the Feast of Passover, they are to be observed at specific dates of the month, he says it plain, straight. You don't have to guess, you don't have to assume. He says it. And if he means that the Sabbath is to be kept after 6 days of work on the 7th day, he means it because 7th day means of the week. Everybody knows that, who is a Jew, that because the days of the week are numbered 1 to 7, once you say the 1st or the 7th, it is as plain as the nose on your face that what God meant was the 1st or the 7th or the 6th or the 5th day of the week when those numbers are used. And once God says 7th day, that's exactly what he means. Now, the next problem with the lunar Sabbath has to do with their problem with the weekly cycle. And they say, well, the Sabbath should be determined by looking up at the moon and determine each month when new moon comes around, and the 8th day of the month and the 15th day and so forth and so forth. Here's the next problem. This is the fifth problem with the lunar Sabbath theory. Let's go to Exodus chapter 16. So now we're in Exodus chapter 16, and we notice that God, far from what the lunar Sabbatarians tried to propose, God did not link the weekly Sabbath to the moon. God sent manna. And we pick up the story in verse 14 of Exodus 16. And when the dew that lay up was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, It is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread of the Lord, bread with which the Lord hath given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man, according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. And the children of Israel did so, and gathered, some more, some less. And when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. And Moses said, Let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left of it until the morning. It bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. They gathered it every morning. Every morning of what? Obviously, of the week. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. And when the sun waxed hot, it melted. And it came to pass that on the sixth day of what? Of the week. Because God is establishing the principle of how the Sabbath should be kept. Not by the moon, but by a weekly cycle. He himself established. And on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said. In other words, they are now on the sixth day of the week. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and seethe that which ye shall seethe. And that which remaineth over, lay up for you to be kept until the morning. In other words, God is now going to work a miracle to show them that he can preserve food that would normally spoil, even on the Sabbath. And it came, and they laid up until the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, Eat today, for today is the Sabbath unto the Lord. Today he shall eat. Today he shall not find it in the field. 6 days he shall gather it. But on the seventh day of the what? Of the week, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? And so we know the rest of the story. Here God, for 40 years they went through this routine. Now if the moon was sufficient to give them the guideline for the weekly cycle, God would not use this method, because the moon would have been there. But no, God wanted to establish He's the omniscient God. While they were in Egypt, even if they had lost track of the weekly cycle, God, who's the omniscient one, had perfect knowledge of the weekly cycle from the first creation week. And so He's now re-establishing the cycle with Israel. And as we can see, God used not the moon. He used the manna experience. And so what happened is that the children of Israel were forced by this repeated cycle every week of the manna experience. For 40 years they went through this until it became ingrained in them. The moon was not sufficient, or could not be the time marker for the weekly cycle. And so God used His own approach, the miracle of the manna, so that by the time 40 years came and went, the children of Israel had it ingrained in their calendar. The weekly cycle remained unchanged, and that carried through until the time of Jesus. When Jesus came, Jesus did not have to correct the Jews about which day was the Sabbath. They were already observing the correct one. If they were observing the wrong Sabbath, He would have, or the wrong day for the Sabbath, He would have corrected it. And nowhere in the history of the life of Jesus on earth did He have to correct the Jews. That now takes us to the next problem of the lunar Sabbath calendar. They tell us that when you go to Psalm 104, and I think verse 19, let's go there. Yes, so they claim that because Psalm 104 verse 19 says, He, God, appointed the moon for seasons, the sun knoweth his going down. Therefore, they argue that this must mean that all of God's holy days, festivals, and seasons must be determined by the moon. Now, this is a poetic psalm or song that was expressed by David. But David was not giving a lesson on the calendar. David just chose some things along the way to express praise to God. And it does mean that everything he said here is absolute fact for everything. Notice, let's go back up and see some of the expressions David used. He says, the trees of the Lord are full of sap. Verse 16, the cedars of Lebanon which he hath planted, where the birds make their nests, and for the stork, the fir trees are her house. It doesn't mean that all birds would make their nests in the cedars of Lebanon. This is just one example that David is giving. He says the hills are a refuge for the wild goats and the rocks for the conies. It doesn't mean that there is some rule which says all goats must be in the hills, and the rocks are just for the conies, and all conies are in the rocks of the hills. No, David just chose randomly expressions along the way to give praise to God in terms of his wondrous works. And then he came to verse 19, and he says he appointed the moon for seasons. He's not saying that it's only the moon that is appointed for seasons. He's just giving an example. Yet the lunar Sabbatarians grab onto this as some absolute rule that all seasons and all festivals and moed, and as the Bible uses the expression moed for the festivals, must be determined by the moon. No. Problems here. Because if you say that in verse 19, you have to say that in verse 18, the hills, only the hills are for the wild goats, and only the rocks are for the conies. No, and only the cedar trees for the birds, the nest of the birds. That's nonsense. These are just random things that David chose in the psalm to express his praise to God. He was not establishing no principle about the calendar in terms of the only rule for the seasons. When we allow the Bible to speak, here's what we see. It's not the moon alone that was established for seasons and for festivals. It's both the moon and the sun in their own order, of course, as it relates to whatever they may relate to. Let's go to Genesis chapter 1 and see the real truth. So here is the real truth. Why the lunar Sabbatarians or the lunar Sabbath advocates don't have a case. The next problem for them is that God did not say it's only the moon that are set up for seasons. Notice in verse 14 of Genesis chapter 1, straight from the mouth of God, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them, plural, be for signs and for seasons." What are the them here? The lights. In other words, the stars and the moon and the sun. It's not just the moon alone that was set up to be markers for special events and for signs or for seasons. No, all of them in their own way, as which may be relevant to what the time marker is about. Verse 15, let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights out of all of the lights in the firmament. The stars and the moon and the sun are all that was in, all the lights were in focus, are the things that will be time markers and for seasons, not just the moon. And then among the lights, God said he made two great ones. And the only one but two great ones. God gave two great lights, the greater light to rule the day. In other words, anything related to the daily cycle. The sun directly relates to that as a season. And we know that the Jews, they had daily moed appointments, whether it be for sacrifice in the morning or sacrifices in the evening. And the day would change in terms of the cycle by way of the moon, by way of the sun. And then he says, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So far from what the lunar Sabbatarians are saying, that it's only the moon that was set up to guide the seasons and the calendar. No. The sun and the moon and the stars in their own way can be used by humans as markers for special events, whether it be among the Jews or any other nation on the planet. So the next problem with the lunar Sabbath theory, is that it misrepresents the scriptures, because it doesn't have any clear "thus said the Lord." It's grabbing scriptures here and there and taking them out of context and trying to patch them together to create a strange new and odd doctrine that not even the Jews themselves know about. The Jews who the Sabbath was entrusted to for thousands of years to pass it on to the world. They know nothing of the so-called lunar Sabbath on the 15th and then the 22nd and the 29th or the 8th of each month. Nothing of the sort is in the scriptures. And anywhere they try to patch scriptures, draw scriptures here and there to patch them together, to try to create some elusive thus saith the Lord, it doesn't hold true. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And that's the next problem. That's the sixth problem of the Lunar Sabbath theory. Let's now move to the seventh problem that they have. The seventh problem, dear listener, is that they keep saying that the calendar of the Jews was changed by Roman law. Constantine and the Gregorian calendar was forced upon the church and forced upon the Jews, and so their calendar was changed. So their Sabbath, the time of the month that they observed, the Sabbath was also changed. Not true. Not true at all. And the reason why I have to reject this theory concocted in the mind of a racist Ku Klux Klan member and Ku Klux Klan members overall is, apart from the six problems I've outlined so far, let's look at the truth of history. The truth of history is that in the time of Jesus, the Jews were observing the Sabbath every seventh day of every week. And the Romans recognized it, and the historians wrote about it. And this seventh day corresponded from the very first century with what they call Saturn, or the day of Saturn, or what we call today in our Western language Saturday. That's what we find in the history books. And in fact, the Greeks, long before the Romans, found this to be true too, because when Antiochus Epiphanes, that little Greek king that tried to subvert the temple service of the Jews, long before the Romans came on the scene, Antiochus Epiphanes used this knowledge of the Jews observing the Sabbath on every seventh day of the week. So they attacked the Jews on those days when they knew they were not supposed to carry burdens and fight wars and all of those things. And so what we see is that the knowledge, the quotations are galore. They are available to show that the Jews, the observance of the Sabbath was weekly, and the Romans and Greeks observed it and saw it and described it as such. And they knew that it corresponded with what we now know to be Saturday, or Saturn's day. So when they claim some calendar change, forcing the Jews to adopt some other calendar which prevented them from observing the Sabbath on the correct day, not true. Because any calendar change that affected the Jews or the Christians of the first 3 centuries of the Christian church. For instance, the Gregorian calendar, the dates in the calendar might have changed, but it didn't change the weekly cycle. And everybody knows that who do any sensible analysis of what happened. The Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar did not affect in any way the cycle of the week or the sequence of the days, the numbered days. You can change a date in the calendar of the month, but if you change the date, the day cycle remains the same, and so the Sabbath remains in place, untouched, even if the date in the month of the calendar was changed. So if, for instance, the calendar was changed to, let's say the Friday would have been the 6th, and if you add some additional days to the month, Friday remains in place, but instead of Friday becoming the 6th, it becomes, you simply change the number of days in the month that would have been connected with that Friday. So the Sabbath remains in place, untouched. The cycle remains the same. And I have in front of me several quotations here. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to place a link below this video, both on Facebook and on YouTube, for you to see the quotes of the Jews and their Sabbath being untouched. Calendar might have been changed in terms of added days, Gregorian calendar, but the cycle of the week remained the same, and their Sabbath remains untouched. And so In closing, let me give you two additional problems I find with the lunar Sabbatarian theory. The next one is they tell you that, well, if the Sabbath was to be observed on the 15th and the 22nd and the 29th and the 8th day of the month, then you would see evidence of it in the Bible. Well, we see evidence totally contradicting that theory. Because we see, for instance, the 15th, the 22nd, the 8th day of the week and of the month being described all of the Bible. And in very many cases, no reference made to it being a Sabbath. A weekly Sabbath of the Ten Commandments, that is. In fact, what we find is that in several cases, the Sabbath does not correspond to their so-called theory of 8th and 15th and 22nd and 29th. Several cases where the Sabbath is shown to occur. For instance, in the case of David, hiding out in a field, the Sabbath came 3 days or the 4th day after the start of the new moon. Because the Sabbath is fixed on the 7th day. The cycle of the days in terms of new moon can change. But the 7th day of the week remains the same. So in the case of David, 3 days after the new moon, hiding out in a field, we see that the Sabbath arrived. Totally debunking this nonsense argument that the Sabbath is always on the 8th and the 29th and the 15th and the 22nd and all these concocted ideas in the minds of Ku Klux Klan members like Jonathan David Brown. Another problem with the lunar Sabbath theory, as I bring this to a close, is in order to keep up their so-called 7th day of each month theory going, they have to arbitrarily drop out days out of the month to keep the cycle going. Now the weekly cycle don't need that, because the weekly cycle is independent of the moon. It's simply 6 days work, 7th day rest. 6 days work after that, 7th day, and that cycle continues independent of whatever the date of the month is. That's how the Jews have known it from time immemorial. And so, in order to keep their so-called 7th day of the month, because the month can be tricky. The month has 29 days, sometimes 30, before the moon cycle completes. And so, because it is so complex to keep up with the cycle of the moon, God made it simple by having the Sabbath being weekly, 7 days. And He never allowed it to be guided by the moon. He established a weekly principle from creation week. And when He was reintroducing the Sabbath and reestablishing it for His people to follow the weekly cycle, He used the manna experience. And therefore they recorded this and kept that going for many centuries and passed it down in their record books. Lunar Sabbatarians have to drop out days of the month. What they call so-called transitional days are not real days, and all of this is nonsense, confusion, concocted in the minds of Ku Klux Klan members. And of course, as I bring this to a close, let me point out, dear listener, that, it is an argument used by the lunar Sabbatarians that you can look up at the moon and determine from the first quarter and the full moon and the last quarter and the so forth the cycle of the week. Nonsense. Why? It is not a reliable, is not an accurate method. How we know that? Because the phases of the moon, it's not clear cut. From one phase to another can take 2 to 3 days to change. And from the naked eye, you can look up and don't know exactly when is the new moon, because the new moon is darkness. You can also have the sky overcast because of bad weather. Days on end too, and you can't really observe the moon to determine the weekly cycle. Different persons can look up at the moon and feel that this full moon is at a certain time in its waxing or waning period. In other words, as it grows or it decreases in size. And because the change takes place over 2-3 days, different persons can look up and see different times of that phase of the moon, and can be off by 2 or 3 days on different parts of the planet if you're trying to determine the weekly cycle by the moon. You can't. It is inaccurate. It is not a good way to determine the start and the end of the week. And that is why God did not use the moon. He used the manna experience, so the children of Israel will record it. After 40 odd years, the cycle will become ingrained in their record books. And even if one person forget what day of the week it was, the next person would have the ability to pass on the knowledge. So not everybody would forget which day of the week it was. The cycle, God used the manna experience in Exodus chapter 16. And the children of Israel as the living oracles to keep a record of the weekly cycle. And that is why up to this day, the Jews don't have a knowledge of the so-called Lunar Sabbath of the 10 Commandments to be observed on the 8th and the 15th and the 22nd and the 29th, and for some cases the 7th and the 14th and 21st and 28th of the month. They have no knowledge of this. Why? Because the Lunar Sabbath people in the last, let's say, 40 years are imposters, concoctors of a false doctrine that they have created to mislead people from observing the true Sabbath. Because that is what it boils down to. When you're trying to, in a complex way, trying to find this elusive Lunar Sabbath, you end up rejecting, stepping over and trampling on the true weekly Sabbath that is to be observed every 7th day of the week, of every week, corresponding with what we know to be Saturday in our lunar calendar. Lunar and solar calendar. Dear listener, I'm going to bring this to a close. I have to bring this to a close. But remember, truth is straight, plain and clear. It stands out boldly in its own defense. But it is not so with error. It is so winding and twisting that it needs a multitude of words to explain it in its crooked form. I don't have to get into all the technicalities and intricacies of the Lunar Sabbath argument. From the basic level, it has already been proven that it is straight from the pit of hell as a means of leading God's Sabbath keepers, those who are genuinely wanting to obey Him, down the path of error. And so they will end up being Sabbath breakers while ironically trying to be Sabbath keepers. Satan is very, very slick. The same thing he did in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, where he used Christians to mislead people from observing the Sabbath. Christians who were anti-Semitic, opposed to the Jews and their way and their observing of the Sabbath. So what did the Christians of the first 3 centuries do? Come up with a fake Sabbath, some so-called new creation memorial, nowhere commanded in Scripture. Sunday. Today what we have is, among true Sabbath keepers, people are losing their way, trying to observe the Sabbath, end up observing a fake Sabbath concocted by no more, no less than Ku Klux Klan members, anti-Semitics, who also set up a fake Sabbath, trying to so-called honor God with their tradition. Seventh-day Adventists, do not be fooled. The Lunar Sabbath theory cannot stand fierce scrutiny or investigation. It fails every test. And so I advise you, stay away from this false doctrine.
before you go. Remember, if you've been blessed by this presentation, don't forget to share it with others so that they can be blessed too.